Some years ago, I worked at a dye works company in the Midlands. The work site was on repurposed land. I was a janitor and also responsible for security. It was a cold December morning. The lock on the main gate had frozen. I got my cigarette lighter to heat up the lock to free it of ice. As I did this, I witnessed the figure of a man. He was dressed all in black and was also wearing a small bowler-type hat. I shouted through the gate for the man to get off sight. He did not acknowledge my warning. There was a reassuring click and I looked down to see the lock was free. As soon as I could open the gate, I ran towards him. He turned and went towards the boiler room. I knew he had made a fatal mistake. I realised that there was no entrance and he could not get away. I advanced towards the back end of the boiler room. As I cornered, I was expecting trouble. To my astonishment, the figure had disappeared. Months later, I had to repoint the brickwork at the back of the boiler room. I was with my workmate when he informed me that the dye works were on repurposed land. I inquired further. He divulged that the land formerly belonged to the church and the boiler room was a former chapel. As I stepped back to examine my work, my expression was that of shock. My workmate witnessed my expression and inquired what was wrong. A penny had dropped. I could see the outline of the original doorway. As I were looking at the former entrance, I recalled the black figure. He had what looked to be like a dress over his trousers. This was the dress code for a chaplain. Back in the year 1978, I was a coal miner that had to relocate. This was for practical reasons. The house I was moving to was a smaller property, but the back garden was enormous. Some time had passed and I decided to build a cabin. There was an old willow tree that was in its way. In due course I started my campaign. The day was warm and bright. As I started to cut it, it was as if the tree was resisting. This was strange because the saw was new. I had used the saw on another tree that was close to the fence line. In the end, I resorted to using a chainsaw. I still had problems getting through it. Eventually, I had success. I heard the sound of creaking and backed off. The tree slowly descended to the ground. Day turned into night. The wind suddenly picked up and a rainstorm ensued. This lasted for 2 minutes. The weather returned to its former glory. I was mystified. It had been a long day and it was time for bed. As I gazed onto my windowsill, I witnessed the bottle squeeze its contents out. I reasoned that it must be due to a sudden temperature change. As time went by, more strange occurrences started to manifest. I heard someone walking upstairs towards the bathroom. The light turned on and the door shut. I ran upstairs expecting to meet an intruder, only to find nothing. I had been working long hours and put it down to being tired. It was time to put some work in on the foundation for the cabin. I started to dig the ground out. I got down to 2 feet deep when I discovered an old leather strap attached to a brass buckle. I decided to place my find in the woodshed. After completing my day's labour, I was dirty and decided to take a bath. As I was running my bath, the steam collected upon the mirrors. There was a rubbing sound that caught my attention. I looked towards the mirror and could see a name forming. Something had spelt a name upon the mirror. The name was Gwen Tertz. I was in shock and was feeling strange. There was a cold shiver that resonated along my spine. For some reason, I decided to clear the name from the mirror. The water in the bath looked inviting. I lowered myself into the warm water. As I laid there, I started to wonder what I should do next. Then I remembered the brass buckle. I had left it outside in the woodshed. Later, I went downstairs to make some tea. The wind was blowing outside. I heard a voice cry out, "I'm innocent. This is a mistake." Cries of protest came from the direction of the woodshed. I could not believe my ears. Looking through the window, I could see no one. It was late, and I wasn't feeling right. I went to bed, perplexed. The next morning, I decided to clean up my find. I was looking at the brass buckle, hoping to find a clue. Nothing emerged. As I wiped the strap clean, I felt an indentation. The indentation revealed a date, 1753. I went to the village library to seek out the records of births and deaths. There was indeed a Gwen Tertz. She was born in 1732 and died in 1753. I looked into the legal records to find she had been accused of witchcraft and was hung. Her body was left for 3 days hanging from the village willow tree. Her body disappeared and was never found. My next door neighbour was a survivor of 2 world wars. For her age, she was very aware and insightful. She was wheelchair bound and often tapped the wall if she needed help. At 3 p.m, she would have afternoon tea. I would visit her and we would talk for an hour. 3 years later, she would pass on. I was sad at the loss of my friend. I would miss our conversations. A year later, I was doing the ironing in the front room. Suddenly, I heard 3 taps from behind the wall. I looked upon the clock to see that the time was 3 p.m. This started to be a frequent occurrence. Eventually, I moved on to a new house. The year was 1978 and I became an Avon representative. I got an order from my friend at work. When I seen the address on the order book, I was in shock. It turned out to be my old house. I kept quiet. When the delivery was due, I took a walk into memory lane. My friend answered the door and invited me in. It was strange to see my old house. There was a strange vibe as I looked around the front room. The open fire was gone. It was replaced with a mock-looking fire, plastic moulded coal that was lit by a rotating light. Passing the order over to her, she placed it upon a table. The table was situated against the wall. As we conversed, we got onto the subject of her neighbour's children. She stated that the children were always making knocking sounds. This clearly irritated her by the expression upon her face. A familiar sound resonated from beyond. We both looked at each other with a bewildered expression. She asked me if I heard the sound of knocking. I acknowledged with a nod. I felt sorrow inside myself. I shrugged to hold back my emotions. I knew who it was. My friend reasoned that the children were playing around. Then she realised it was a school day.